Hello people, I am back on YouTube again today to talk to you about real INFJs. What are some characteristics that set an INFJ apart from other people? How can we look at a person in our lives to determine whether or not they are actually an INFJ? So I've got a bunch of bullet points in front of me here right now that I'm going to go down. These are just some general characteristics that I see in myself and that I see in other INFJs that I've known before. I'm going to go down that list, describe these different bullet points, these different characteristics. And then I'm going to go through the 4 letters INFJ, tell you how those things present themselves in the actual INFJ personality, and then I'm going to go through the actual cognitive functions at the end of the video, and then hopefully by the end of that video you'll have a better understanding of what INFJs actually look like in real life, and hopefully you can have more information to make better judgments on other people's types. So that is my goal in this video. Let's get started. So the first bullet point is the INFJ stare. As you probably realized, I did a really weird thing with my eyes at the very beginning of this video. That is a part of the INFJ stare. Sometimes I do that. I'm pretty sure it's because I'm pretty sure it's related to INFJ neural wiring. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it is. So the INFJ stare, I'm going to actually demonstrate it for you right here in front of the camera. I'm going to play a video clip on my screen, and I'm going to actually do the INFJ stare so that you can actually see exactly what it looks like in everyday life. Because most people just describe it with words, and because it's an actual thing that you can see in real life, why not just show it to you? So that's what I'm going to do right now.
My name is Heather Lee. I'm not in charge here. I wasn't here when you went missing. I can see you going through the old Treadstone files, retracing your history. I know you're looking for something. Let me help you find it.
And that was enough of that. So, I'm not sure what that footage looked like. I'm not going to stop the camera, but it should be a pretty accurate video of what the INFJ stare looks like, at least in my perspective. And I'm pretty sure I'm an INFJ, so that should be a very accurate portrayal of what it looks like. So what's going on when I do that? I'm trying to look into the person's soul, like many people say. I'm looking beneath them. I'm trying to look past their eyeballs, basically. It's kind of hard to describe in words, especially in front of a camera, but I'll try to write about it in the description because I'm better at writing than I am at speaking. But basically I'm trying to look into that person's soul, and it is a very intense stare. It's not a blank stare, as some people say. It is a very intense stare. It's like laser vision. You're trying to look through that person. You're trying to look into that person's soul. There's nothing blank about it. It's a squint. And sometimes when you do it so hard that you almost cross your eyes, like I did at the very beginning of the video. Sometimes that happens, sometimes that doesn't. When you really do it, work at that stare hard, sometimes your eyes do kind of cross a little bit. So that's the best I can do for the INFJ stare. Moving on to the next bullet point, secretive nature. So many people say that the INFJ is very secretive. That's a common aspect that people talk about a lot. That is very true, but other people say that the INFJs who are not secretive are the healthy ones, and the secretive nature is actually a sign of an unhealthy INFJ. This is not true. And someone being secretive does not mean that they're unhealthy. It certainly can be a symptom of unhealthy psychological inside, but it's definitely. But an INFJ is naturally secretive because they're so authentic, they're so genuine, they feel emotions deeper than a lot of other people. They value authenticity, which makes them more secretive. And that's not bad, that's not unhealthy. And typically most of the people who say that they are INFJ, despite being extremely non-secretive about their personal lives, and they use the argument, well, I'm a healthy INFJ and that's why I'm not secretive. It's not true. Because an unhealthy INFJ may be secretive, but a healthy INFJ will be just as secretive. That's not your health. The amount of how healthy you are has nothing to do with how secretive you are, because a healthy INFJ is going to be is just as much secretive as the not healthy INFJ. And typically when an INFJ seems to be more extroverted, or not extroverted, but less secretive about themselves, more ready to openly share about themselves, that's probably not a good sign, even if they are INFJ, because INFJs are very intuitive, and they should be valuing these things. They should have very tight grasp on them. They shouldn't want to be giving out all of their personal information to other people, because if they're healthy, they should actually be trying to keep a hold of that, because that's who they are. If they give it to other people, they're going to be less of who they are. They're not going to have that anymore. That's not their personal property anymore. So that's just how the INFJ works. It's not unhealthy and it's not healthy. It's just the way the INFJ works. Most INFJs are secretive. That doesn't mean that they're not unhealthy. That doesn't mean that they are unhealthy. So the third bullet point, INFJs will have a vision for themselves. They can see their whole life and death before them. Their lives represent an idea. So the INFJ has this vision for themselves. They have to do this in their life. They have to become this idea. They have to represent this cause or represent this idea for everyone else. You can see this actually quite often in literature. Look at V for Vendetta.
Why won't you die? Beneath this mask, there is more than flesh. Beneath this mask, there is an idea, Mr. Creedy. And ideas are bulletproof.
Look at The Great Gatsby.
I can find it again.
Some vision of himself that he had put into loving Daisy. Uniform hid the truth that he was a penniless young man, with only that grand vision of himself.
I knew that when I kissed this girl, I would be forever wed to her.
Look at Batman Begins.
If you make yourself more than just a man, if you devote yourself to an ideal, and if they can't stop you.
These are all highly intuitive characters who become an idea, who turn their lives into the manifestation of an idea. That's a key sign of someone who's an introverted intuition dominant, because that's what Carl Jung wrote about. This is a key thing to look for in introverted intuitive. Creating your life, living your life to manifest as an idea. So, and I made a video about that actually included clips from those three movies that I referenced. And then the second part of that, can see their whole life and death before them. So a healthy INFJ with strong introverted intuition can, in a sense, kind of see their whole life before them. They can kind of look at patterns of the past and see how those patterns are going to play out in the future, and they can, in a way, kind of sense that they're going to die this way. They're going to die trying to do this, or going to die trying to achieve this goal, and they're going to fail, and they're going to die. That's kind of the way I look at my life, because I've seen patterns in my past, and I can see how they're going to play out in the future. And I feel like I know how I'm going to die. It's kind of weird, but I do. It's just intuitive. I can look at the patterns of the past and see into the future through those. I can fill in the gaps. I can connect the dots.
I felt like I could see everything that had happened. And everything that was going to happen. It was like a perfect pattern laid out in front of me.
And you do feel like every part of your life is already planned out. Like you can already see it happening. Nothing ever surprises you, because everything happens the way it's supposed to happen. It all happens the way you foresaw happening. Now it might happen differently, but but where you go as a person always stays the same. Where you go value-wise, moral-wise, always stays the same. You can just see your entire life just playing out before you before it happens.
And I realized that we were all part of it. And all trapped by it.
So do you know what's going to happen?
No. It was a feeling. But I can guess.
So INFJs often have very unique perspectives on ordinary things. So I grew up as a Christian in the Christian community at a Presbyterian church, and I was always the one in my youth group who had very different ideas on religion. I came up with all of these different theories and all of these different interpretations of the Bible that nobody else came up with. I challenged lots of things that nobody else challenged. I found problems with certain ideas, with certain assumptions that nobody else had a problem with. And that was always who I was growing up. I was always the one who challenged assumptions, always saw the big picture, always connected the dots that nobody else connected. This is the fifth bullet point. When an INFJ sees a movie coming out of the theater, they will want to talk about the film's messages. This recently happened when I just came out of a movie with a couple other people. The other people wanted to talk about things that were happening in their lives, just ordinary things like what was going on later that night or what had happened earlier that day. When I wanted to talk about the film's messages, I wanted to talk about the themes. I wanted to talk about what the film said, how it affected me, and nobody else really seems to want to talk about that. I guess that's because I'm an intuitive. I don't really know, but that's a key difference that I see in myself that I don't really see in anyone else. The next bullet point, see the world through a laggy camera. Because INFJs have dominant introverted intuition, oftentimes our extroverted sensing routes right into our introverted intuition. And because introverted intuition takes such a long time to process, because it's so subconscious, because it's not a conscious function, because it works so much below the boundary of consciousness, we don't really quite have access to that extroverted sensing information, that sensory data coming in from our eyes, from our ears. We don't have access to that until a little bit later. So it kind of feels like we're watching the world through the eyes of a laggy camera. So we see things, but we don't understand them until just a little bit later. We don't actually see something and try to actually think about what does that mean. We just somehow know what that means. We see something and we automatically, a few seconds later, actually see it consciously and already know what's going to happen next, because it all routes right into our introverted intuition. We see something and the first thing that we are concerned about is what's going to happen next. It goes through the introverted intuition and it delays. We see the outcome, what's going to happen in the future, before we can even understand what's going on in the present. The next one often feel lost inside themselves because their inner world is so big. I've only heard a couple other INFJs out there talk about this, so I thought I would include this. Because we're so intuitive and because we have such big ideas inside of our heads, our inner worlds are a lot more vivid than most other people's are. Because we have this vision for ourselves, like I said in the other bullet point, because we have this big huge vision for ourselves and we are this idea, we become this idea, we become the personification of that idea. We have all these different ideas in our head. We often feel lost inside of our heads because our minds are so much bigger than our outer worlds. And part of that is probably because of inferior extroverted sensing. But another part of that is just because of introverted intuition. We're so idea oriented, and we're so much inside of our heads. We are introverted and intuitive at the same time, which means that we dwell mostly inside of our heads. So it's reasonable to assume that we would get lost inside of our heads the way other people get lost inside of the real world, because our inner world, our minds are so much bigger than the outer world. So this kind of plays into another assumption that some people make about INFJs. Some people say that INFJs are not clumsy. No, some people say that INFJs are clumsy. How they talk about how INFJs are always the last person in a room to smell a bad smell. They're always they're always the last person to see something that everybody else sees, but that's not true. Inferior sensing does not mean that that your extroverted sensing is bad. It doesn't mean that you're at the bottom of the list of people who can use SC. Now, it's definitely not your dominant function. It's not your first three functions, but it's definitely not your eighth either. So an ENFP, who I believe has extroverted sensing as their eighth function, is going to be a lot more clumsy than an INFJ, at least in neurotypology. So when people say that INFJs are clumsy, and that's a key characteristic of INFJ, that's not true, because there are 8 other types that have extroverted sensing, not even in their first four cognitive functions. So that's not true at all. Because it's in our first 4 means that it's actually pretty strong. So I just want to clarify that. So the next bullet point I have is that INFJs very often use metaphors. One very easy thing you can do to determine whether or not somebody is an INFJ, especially in a YouTube video, if they use a ton of metaphors in their videos, if they're explanatory videos, they use a lot of metaphors, they're probably at least an introverted intuitive dominant. Look at my videos. My very first video was centered around the iceberg analogy, that metaphor. And my first 2 videos, I think, maybe 3 or 4, most of my videos that are actually explaining things, actually every single one of my videos uses a metaphor as its primary foundation. And there are a couple other people on YouTube who I see do this, but there's only one other INFJ out there who actually does that as well. And that is a key characteristic of an introverted dominant, of an introverted intuitive. The people who say that they're INFJ who don't use a single metaphor probably aren't INFJs. Because if your dominant function is introverted intuition, you're going to use metaphors. Now, you don't have to, but it's very likely that you will. And you can see that play out in my videos. You can see that play out in Thinker of Everything. You can see that play out in some other channel that I don't know the name of. It's not. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're an introverted intuition dominant, but it's a very good sign. And if you don't use metaphors, you're probably not using introverted intuition as your dominant function. So the next bullet point is INFJs strive for authenticity. Lots of people use this as a key characteristic of an INFJ. That's not terribly true. I mean, we certainly do, but I think every type does. I wouldn't say that INFJs are more prone to it than others, although we certainly can be. But I wouldn't use that as a key determinant in finding true INFJs, because so many other types can be like that. Nobody values the lack of authenticity. Everyone wants to be authentic. Now, INFJs might be a little bit more so, but you can't use that to find out whether or not someone's an actual INFJ, because that's all across the board. Everyone wants to be authentic. But then again, not everyone uses metaphors. Not everyone's naturally secretive. Not everyone has this profound vision for themselves. So I wouldn't use that authenticity thing as a factor. So my next bullet point, this is kind of vague, kind of hard to explain. One-on-one situations with other people. So when I sit down with someone, if I'm in a position of authority over them, and if it's like a mentoring situation, it's very easy for me to dig into that person, to ask questions that kind of subconsciously force them to reveal things about themselves that they normally wouldn't reveal. It's very, very, very easy for me to make people feel comfortable, make people feel it, like it's okay to talk about that kind of thing. That's just in my personality. It's very easy for me to do that. I don't know why that is, but it just is. It's kind of awkward almost, because I can get people to say such deep things about themselves that they normally wouldn't say, and then by the end of it, it's like, wait, why are we talking about this? But that's just what oftentimes happens when I'm in that situation, because it's just so easy for me to go to those levels, to dig into that person, to go deeper than other people do. The next bullet point, INFJs love sad music. I see this a lot on other videos, on other personality tests. I'm not sure what exactly it is. I'm not sure where it stems from in the stack, in the cognitive functions. But INFJs, from my personal experience, I do like sad music, and most other people don't like sad music. I'm not really sure why that is, but I do see that pattern. Although I'm not sure whether or not it's specific to the INFJ. It could also be true of INTJs, INFPs, probably INFPs, probably most introverted intuitives, or most INFs, or most NFs, I don't know. But I don't think it's just INFJs, but that is true of INFJs as I know them. I have two more bullet points. One, second to last, onion personality / chameleon. People say that INFJs have these ridiculously thick personalities with tons of layers, and they talk about how you can never really get to the core, of an INFJ, because they have so many layers. If you think that you know the INFJ, you probably don't, because they're just showing you another layer of themselves. You have to get through that one, and then you have to get through that one, then you have to get through that one, and it's a never-ending process, because we have so many layers to our personalities. Our personalities are so complex, you can never get to the bottom of it. Because of our dominant introverted intuition, because our heads are so big, because there's so many different rooms and cavities inside of our head, so many different layers to our personalities, so many different aspects to our personalities. It's very difficult to get to know us. So we are kind of like onions. We can be very mysterious, and we don't let people in very easily. And an example of that in my videos, if you've paid attention, if you've watched my other videos, you'll see that I don't reveal a lot at all about myself. Now, in the one comment on the You Are Not An INFJ video, I kind of did, but that's in writing. That's kind of different. And that was necessary too. But like in person and in videos, when talking to a camera, it's much more difficult to reveal things about ourselves, because we're so secretive. And that plays into the onion personality. There's so many different layers. Once you think you know us, you find out that that's just another layer. There's more layers underneath. And oftentimes this leads to the thing that happens when you work with someone in your office for years, and then you find out one thing about them, and you realize that you had no idea who they were at all. You can be close to an INFJ for a very long time, and yet still have no idea who they are, because they're so secretive, because their personalities are so complex.
Mathilda Bagshot lives at Godric's Hollow.
Well, that's where she first met Dumbledore.
You don't mean to say he lived there too?
Honestly, my boy, are you sure you knew him at all?
and because we're kind of like social chameleons, we can morph our personalities into different personalities and adapt to any situation. Now, other personalities can do that too, but INFJs as well. So I do want to go into this bullet point real quick. A big problem when INFPs mistype as INFJs is because they think that they have empathy. I think that the distinction between INFJ empathy and INFP empathy is that INFJs cannot turn off their empathy. INFJs can't turn it off, and I believe that INFPs can. An INFP can decide to have empathy for a person crying on a movie, but an INFJ can't just turn that off like that, because they're much more affected by it. It's much more deeper, and it goes straight to their inner being. It doesn't. There's no switch. You can't just turn it off unless you try really hard. And I don't think that's true for an INFP. So those are all my bullet points. Let me look at the time. I'm at 24 minutes. I have time to go into the INFJ and then the NIFETI and SE. This has been covered in a whole bunch of other videos, so I'm not going to go in as much depth as most other people do. So basically, introvert, the first letter in INFJ is the I. It means we're introverted. It means that we, it doesn't mean that we're shy, it doesn't mean we're awkward. It just means that we get our energy from being alone as opposed to being with other people. And it also means, this is what I don't hear very often, but what it also means is that we, instead of acting in the moment, instead of just acting in the moment, responding to things when something happens to us, or when we're about to make a decision, we think about it before we act. Haven't given a lot of thought to this, so that's probably not the best way of describing it, but in short, we introverts tend to think before they act, and extroverts tend to act before they think. I think that's the best way of describing it. And the next letter, N, stands for, well, it doesn't stand for introvert, it doesn't stand for intuition, but because I starts with an I, you can't use I again, because that wouldn't make sense. So you skipped a letter, went to the N. N stands for introvert. N stands for intuition, sorry. It's very similar to the actual word intuition. You know, you can look up in the dictionary. It basically means that okay, so there's a dichotomy here. There's intuitive and there's sensing. The sensor will look at a painting and see paint strokes, while an intuitive will look at a painting and see a bigger picture. So intuition and intuitive looks at the bigger picture, looks at the idea, looks at the message of something. They look at the implications. They try to analyze something as a whole, but they don't really look at the details. They're not detail oriented. They're not sensory oriented. They prefer to look at the bigger picture. And intuition in itself is looking at past patterns and predicting the future, oftentimes subconsciously. And then the sensor, on the other hand, is very sensory oriented, more detail oriented. They'll look at the paint strokes. They're going to look at the individual leaves. They're going to look at the individual trees. They're going to look at the details. They're the solid things that you can write down on a piece of paper. They're going to look at all those details and analyze those details. They're not going to look at the bigger picture. Now, they can look at the bigger picture, and intuitive can look at the details, but it's a preference. It's not so much a dichotomy as it is a preference. So the third letter, F, stands for feeling, and this dichotomy is feeling versus thinking. So the feeler typically makes decisions based off of emotion, while the thinker typically makes decisions based off of logic. So the feeler will when forced with a decision, is going to choose the option that makes them feel best, that they think is best aligned with their moral values, with their feelings, while the thinker is going to choose the option that is best aligned with their logical way of looking at things, with justice, with logic. So then the fourth letter, judging, this dichotomy is judging versus perceiving. So the judger is externally organized and the perceiver is internally organized. So the judger on the outside looks very organized. They have plans, they have a very neat desk, they're always organizing things in their external lives, but internally, in their inner lives, they're not so organized. And it's the opposite for the perceiver. So that's the 4 letters of INFJ. So now I'll quickly go into the cognitive functions, despite the fact that I've already touched on 3 out of these 4 in my other videos. So introverted intuition, I used the iceberg analogy. You have a ton of subconscious thought processes going on below the boundary of consciousness, and those are generalizations that create conclusions that build off of conclusions, broader conclusions that are below those, and eventually you get up to the surface of consciousness and one little idea pops out into the consciousness, and that's the conclusion that the introverted intuition gives you. Now, this intuition happens introvertedly. It happens inside of us. It's focused inward. So it is much more concentrated. It's much stronger, and it's much more focused than extroverted intuition, which instead is focused outward and connects a whole bunch of external ideas together rather than a whole bunch of internal ideas. So a introverted intuitive will connect the ideas anchor and strong, while an extroverted intuitive will connect the ideas anchor and navy. That's not the best example, but that was something that happened to me not too long ago. That was a very clear example of it, though, and I think I've referenced that in my You Are Not An INFJ video comment. But I've already explored that. So moving on to FE, extroverted feeling. The INFJ who uses extroverted feeling relies on other people to feel and understand their own emotions, while the introverted feeler relies on themselves to feel emotion, to understand emotion, and others people to extrovert emotion, I think. I made a video on that, so you can look at that. I'll just keep it at that. But all of these functions, these four function dichotomies, the introverted feeling, introverted intuition, extroverted intuition, they all work the same way. Introverted thinking is directed inward towards internal ideas, and extroverted thinking is directed outward towards external ideas. And the same with sensing, and the same with everything else. So I'll leave it at that because my memory is probably up by now. Not yet. I'm half an hour in. So I hope that helps helped somebody. If you have ideas for me for future videos, I would be happy to consider them. So I kind of am running out of ideas at this point. I would certainly like to know what you would like me to talk about. If anything, probably nothing, but that's okay. I'm trying to respond to all your comments. I helped you in some way, and that I'm benefiting the MBTI community in some way with this information. If you think that I'm wrong about any of this stuff, please comment below so we can talk about it and debate about it in a logical and non-personal format. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope that I help somebody. And please give me suggestions for future videos. I will gladly consider them, and hopefully we can work towards improving the MBTI community through this channel. That's about all I have for you today, so have a nice day.